LGBTI activist movement has been one of the most successful social justice movements in modern times, and part of that success has been down to the unity within the movement itself, a core sense of the shared fight for shared goals. But the past 5 years have really tested this unity, as LGBTI people are scapegoated by politicians and people have become more and more divided in a world dominated by social media. Remaining a cohesive movement is a challenge. Hello, my name is Brian Finnegan, and you are listening to The Frontline, a podcast for LGBTI activists from ILGA-Europe in Brussels. In this episode, we're taking the time to look back at a panel discussion that took place during our annual conference last October in Bucharest. The title was The Courage to Work Across Differences, and our panel explored how we can foster the unity that's the greatest strength of our movement. Moderated by ILGA-Europe board member Simona Mursek from Ljubljana Pride, the panel explored the opportunities our current times have given us to better understand and support each other across different identities and experiences.
This panel is about the courage to work across differences. And we've been seeing and hearing that as we are navigating the coming time, fostering unity in all our diversity will remain our greatest strength as a movement. Now, already here, we're touching upon maybe a challenging word, a word called unity. So what I would like us to think about when we talk today about and use the word unity is that this is a way how we stand together united. Okay, so when we talk about unity, it's about standing together united. The past years have tested this unity. The political instrumentalization of our communities, polarization of society, and tightening civil space have all had a clear impact on our movement. But they also brought to surface a chance to better understand and support each other across different identities and experiences. How do we address the racism, sexism, and xenophobia within our movement and communities? Big question. Are we able to take a critical look at ourselves and our work? Another big question. How can we meet others where they are, creating space for learning and growing together? Crucial question. And how do we continue to do that, knowing that we might face wrongs from those we work with? And we carry that trauma with us. So how do we work and continue and go on with that? Together, we will look at ways to address structural inequalities within the movement, hold space for differences, and build bridges within. So this is going to be one of the most important elements of this panel. But I invited also our panelists, when we were having some preparation chats, to also take a look outward. What is our positionality within the wider world? How much power do we hold in relation to all the forces that surround our movement and communities? And how does the power of this unity we will be talking together today come into play in that relation? So with me today is Simon Blake from Stonewall UK. Simon Blake is the Chief Executive of Stonewall, the United Kingdom's largest LGBTQ+ human rights charity. With us, we also have Dr. Matt Kennedy from Trans Equality Together Ireland. Dr. Matt Kennedy is an interdisciplinary empiricist in the area of trans studies, an educator and a writer, and the outreach manager for the Trans Research Association of Ireland. Matt, welcome. And a very big welcome also to Nari Alibekova from Transdocha, Kazakhstan. Nari Alibekova is a woman human rights defender and trans feminine sex workers' rights defender from Kazakhstan. Nari has been working to protect the rights of trans sex workers since 2015. Her personal successful experience of fighting for accountability and bringing perpetrators to justice led her to start raising awareness about the rights of trans feminine sex workers. In 2021, she founded Transdocha, a trans sex workers' rights initiative that provides various types of assistance to trans feminine sex workers in Almaty and other localities across Kazakhstan. We're going to start with question Matt, for you. We've heard that you're from Trans Equality Together, and this is a coalition of civil society organizations working to create an Ireland where trans and non-binary people are equal, safe, and valued. What have been the challenges and opportunities in building bridges, working across differences, and creating space to better understand each other? What does it look like to work strategically together? What has it looked like for mainstream LGBTI or other non-trans specific organizations in terms of really investing in this work and looking critically at themselves, but also outward, as we said before? So maybe this is a good starting point for us from your experience.
I suppose to kind of introduce a little bit of the context in which my work is situated, Trans Equality Together and other LGBT organisations working in Ireland as well, is kind of think about the journey that Ireland has kind of gone on very much in the last 20 to 30 years, especially when we're thinking about the kind of gender and sexual legacy that Ireland holds, particularly in relation to its colonial past. There is certainly a sense that Ireland moved towards being, from a kind of a political context, much more able to engage the various sorts of rights and liberties that LGBTQI plus people need in order to exist safely within Irish society, such as the kind of decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1993, and then particularly in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, the introduction of marriage equality, the introduction of gender recognition for trans people, and all of those various different kind of meaningful evidences of social progress kind of have to be held in tension with the fact that while Ireland in a broader kind of global and European context is doing quite well, there are still huge challenges that are facing the LGBT community and the trans community more specifically as it kind of relates to my work. And you can kind of see, as is kind of endemic of what's going on across, a European context specifically, is that there is a very focal pushback against LGBTQ plus social rights and liberties, specifically organizing around trans identities and really taking up trans femininity and trans young people as these kind of figures almost to instigate against that kind of progress. And I suppose to kind of think about coalition building in the context of Trans Equality Together and broader work within an Irish context, some of the challenges that I think are definitely, first of all, around a commitment from the Irish government, and that definitely extends to, I think, other European states as well, to a kind of a scarcity ideology. So this idea that resources, particularly for marginalised and minoritized communities, are finite, and that puts us in direct tension, competition, and opposition with one another in ways that delimit opportunities for solidarity, intersectionality, and crucially coalition. And so I think part of the challenge for various different coalitions is to kind of recognize that, number one, scarcity ideology, as it's committed to by the state, is never a sort of ubiquitous decision. It's always being done in the context of political and economic goals. Like, the state has something to gain by splintering us, because overall, if various different marginalized communities and minoritized communities are working together in really strategic ways, we stand to have much more crucial power in terms of organizing social justice. So I think that's kind of a first bit, is how do you overcome that scarcity ideology that we've become so attuned to, particularly in a neoliberal context. I think the other piece then as well is kind of speaking to the broader challenge around identity politics, in that there is and again, thinking about the state, like, there is an awful lot of a perpetuation of identity politics within various different state policies in kind of sequestering various different groups. And Ireland has a wide variety of specific state level strategies that are quite specific to the LGBT community and are hugely meaningful and entirely necessary, but there has to be a concern around how does that potentially create challenges around solidarity when there are other marginalized, minoritized communities who maybe aren't seeing the intersectionality of their identities reflected in those strategies, and then kind of vice versa, particularly for trans people. And so I think some of that is to try and kind of intervene into the ways in which identity politics tries to create various different differences across people that actually aren't reflected of people's life worlds. And part of the, I think, opportunities that emerge from some of the coalition building is to try and connect with individual organizations services, grassroots groups that already are acutely aware of the intersectional identities of the people that they're working with. And it creates opportunities then to push back against this broader, I suppose, social understanding of trans people being nothing more than their gender. And I do think as well, just in terms of kind of opportunities, something that definitely I have found to be hugely helpful, particularly given that a huge amount of like my organizing background and my like academic training is in feminism, was to be able to connect back into the kind of feminist legacy within an Irish context that is hugely responsible for the social change and social justice that is intrinsic to the ways in which Ireland was able to progress and still is in a wide variety of ways deeply misogynistic and sexist. But those kind of crucial feminist underpinnings, those are kind of ways that we can, I suppose, intervene into what people see as ultimate differences between trans organizing and maybe women's rights along those lines as well. And some of that I think is really linked to recognizing, the ways in which gender is a central, organizing principle of power that isn't just affecting trans people or the LGBT community. I think there can be this certain narrative that unless you have this sort of marginalized or minoritized gender identity, that gender isn't somehow organizing the ways in which you experience your life, both socially, politically, and economically. And so I think that has been a huge opportunity for solidarity, particularly between various different trans groups and feminist groups in an Irish context, as well as to sort of acknowledge that really meaningful work that has been done and kind of connect back into it as well.
So Simon, coming to you, Stonewall is a large national advocacy organization. How has the organization invested in addressing structural inequalities within the movement and included different identities and experiences?
Sure. So Stonewall is 35 years old and was originally set up as an LGB charity and was LGB focused for the first 26 years of its existence. And then in 2015, made a decision to, after quite a lot of consultation with the trans community, many of whom were cross that we hadn't done the work earlier, but to become trans inclusive. And that led to the development of a series of publications, of investment in advocacy, policy work, and engagement with the community. And that work continues as a really important strand of the work, both on an integrated basis into everything that we do, and also some specific streams of work. To Matt's point about there are times when you need to take that specific look and times when you're working across LGBTQ plus identities. So that was one very specific a strategic change, which we did about a decade ago. And then at the same sort of time, there were conversations about who wasn't represented or didn't feel represented by Stonewall's work within and across all communities, and recognised that we needed to do more work to address issues around race and racism within the community, and formed a strategic partnership with UK Black Pride, who have pioneered and developed all sorts of work across Black and people of colour communities across the UK and beyond. And that's been really, really important work. I've only been chief exec for 3.5 weeks at Stonewall. And one of the things which I've been doing as part of that is talking to a lot of people who've been involved in Stonewall's work over the last 35 years. And one of the things that's been really striking is how many people need to see themselves and feel themselves in order to feel invested. And I've been really struck about how much work we have got to do to ensure that everybody does feel as though they are committed, that they do believe in solidarity, that they believe that the struggles which are struggles now are also their struggles. And in particular, thinking about the language we use, thinking about the harms of the past, thinking about what people see when they look at their future, and how that trauma, I guess, lives on in people. And sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we can forget to make sure that people feel involved and included in the things which might be absolutely top of the list for us now. And to give a very specific example, if you look at the use of the word queer, which has been reclaimed and absolutely cheerleaded and believe, we lose the language. For some gay men, that can feel very triggering and unsupportive, and so can push people out. So your question was about how do we involve marginalized identities. Starting point is making strategic interventions to make sure that we're doing and make sure people are involved and amplified and led. And my second point is, and let's make sure that we take everybody with us on that journey and make sure that everybody feels seen, heard, and represented, and not to assume privilege, engagement, or involvement. And how can we make sure that we represent people on the way?
Thank you very much. I have a little sub question or continuous question there, because we were talking a lot about this, the reality of our polarized world. And I guess a lot of organizations might also perceive it challenging doing the kind of work that you're talking about, that maybe there are some costs or trade-offs if you start, developing yourself or doing politics the way you've just described. So what are the benefits when we do come together like that as an organization and work strategically towards the common goals?
I mean, there's always costs and trade-offs to everything, isn't there? And I think that is what we recognise when you've got limited resources, you've got limited time, you've got all sorts of things. The benefit is that we are ensuring that everybody, the issues for everybody are reflected, understood, and that we're working towards improvement, inclusion, equality for everybody. The potential cost is that we leave people behind, that people feel ignored and excluded. And that's the point, I think, which I'm making here, is that we can't afford, either financially or morally or from a solidarity perspective, for people to believe that we are not concerned about the whole community. And that takes time and care and a lot of activity, and actually that sort of hard yard of constant engagement, talking to think about how you engage people. And if we don't do it, the risk is that we see more and more fragmentation. We see people divided within. I mean, in the UK, we've seen a lot of fragmentation from within the movement, and we just can't afford for that to continue. So we've got to find ways to ensure that we're understanding. I think sometimes we disagree from a position of misunderstanding, and I'm really happy to disagree, but we have to understand each other first.
Nari, you come from at least what somebody like myself would perceive a very different context, maybe than the UK or Ireland or Slovenia, where I come from. So in your context, what do you see is challenging this unity of our movement that we are trying to address today in this panel? Transdocha challenges the stigmatization of trans women and trans sex workers. What has been your experience in creating spaces for holding difference, learning and creating better understanding across different identities and experiences?
I wanted to respond that globally what I'm observing is the growth of the anti-gender movements in Central Asia, Caucasus and other places, especially due to Russia's neo-colonial geopolitics, and its impact is huge in Russia. These anti-gender organizations are heavily supported by the government, individual functionaries who are trying to halt our work and destroy our unity. For example, they initiated an anti-LGBT petition recently, which was only partially adopted thanks to concerted efforts of LGBT activist community. As to sex workers and their context, this sector is very stigmatized, and trans sex workers face double, triple stigmatization. And the police, who we expect would protect people, are the main perpetrators. And in this context, it was really challenging to unite the community of trans sex workers. But thanks to the trust we have built together, we managed to unite. This helped us to come up with different strategies, such as rapid response mechanism. And so the trans initiative group Transdocha is not only a place of engagement and source of information, but also a place where trans women can get emergency support through hotline. We react to cases of abuse and violence that are taking place practically every day. Unfortunately, abuse and violence against trans people in Kazakhstan is very much normalized. The fact that we could unite and create our own community is exemplary. Our group is also very popular among cisgender sex workers because they see our unity as the most effective protection mechanism.
инструмент для защиты себя.
Thank you for sharing a bit more of what concretely Transdocha does. Maybe the part that is also interesting for us is because, you know, already in your introduction, I was mentioning that you are also an important, like for you is important to be part of the feminist movement and to work together with others, right? What does that mean in your context? For example, how do you work together with other LGBTI organizations or groups, activists? How do you work together and build alliances with, you know, wider civil society or other actors? And, you know, are there any particular challenges? How do they manage to, in a way, understand that your fight is their fight as well?
Our fight is also a part of a wider movement, joint wider LGBT efforts. Because problems faced by trans people is not our issue. This should be considered as an issue of the wider movement as well. And we need to unite our efforts to effectively advocate for our rights. Sorry, I might not have clearly understood the question.
Извините, я немного не поняла вопрос здесь с переводом.
So what I'm interested in is that in many contexts, when we are trying to put in the center of a political agenda, activist agenda, needs of communities that are very much marginalized outside of centers of power. In your case, trans, feminine, sex workers, that mainstream organizations, I come from a pride organizing organization, right? Mainstream organizations, LGBT organizations, but also other civil society movements might perceive taking on fights that belong to more or are perceived to belong to more marginal communities, that it doesn't just happen, that it's difficult to put that into the center. So do you have some experiences? How do you do that in Kazakhstan? How do you put a more activist, a more political agenda to the needs of trans feminine sex workers?
When we receive emergency support requests, we engage with other partner organizations, so to refer trans women to instances or services which we do not have access to, but our partners do. Based on the causes of abuse and violence, we document them and write advocacy reports, which are then submitted to UN treaty bodies. We try to filter out some of them in an attempt to turn them into strategic litigation.
I think it's also one of the things to explore a bit further, this working together, right? Because it's where we started also our panel. What is this unity we're talking about? How do we work together in that way? Do we maybe have a question or two that our colleagues would like to ask the panelists?
Yes, we do have a question, which is around finding strategies. So what strategies do we use when there is a misalignment of values, or when working with parts of the community or other actors where there is disagreement?
I think this question just brings us to continue where we stopped. So would you like to, you feel a bit called out, Simon?
I first started working with Stonewall when I worked at the National Children's Bureau, which is a children's organisation. And at the time, children's organisations were not aligning with Stonewall's mission. The two policy asks at the time were repeal of Section 28, which was the similar, I think, to the legislation in Bulgaria, which is about teaching about homosexuality in schools, and also the equalising the age of consent. And at that point, the children's organisations were not supporting that. And there was a less polarised, because we didn't have that sort of social media context in which it was played out very publicly, but very clear divide. And I spent a lot of time talking to Stonewall, talking to the children's organisations, understanding why the children's organisations were finding it difficult to come out publicly, even if privately they did support, and then also trying to find language which would enable them to understand that it was aligned to values. It was about justice. It was about fairness. It was about equity. It did also include protection. And in doing that translation of language, we did get the children's organisations around the table, not agreeing 100% on everything, but agreeing on 70% and then 80% and then 90%. But it really took a lot about time of starting from a position, I think Shoba talked about starting from a position of good intent, recognising that it wasn't willful ignorance, prejudice, discrimination, but understanding and alignment and thinking about their other stakeholders and how they could manage their other stakeholders as well.
I think what you're touching upon for many of us can resonate maybe when we reflect to our work with the education sector, with the schools and all the different educational institutions. And I think in many of our countries, that is one of the things that is a huge challenge right now. At least for me personally, it resonates a lot what you're saying there. But maybe Nari or Matt, you are also inspired by the question. Matt, you want to go?
Yeah, I think just in terms of strategies, one of the things that I would definitely add in terms of the work that I've been involved in Ireland is probably around consciousness raising, particularly when we think about engaging the relationship between trans communities and like women's organizations, service providers and groups in taking up kind of that key feminist methodology and kind of meeting people with where they're at and like thinking about consciousness raising as a method that's, you know, deeply entrenched in kind of empathy, solidarity and support already, and kind of acknowledges that the individuals who come to that space are already bringing a very particular relationship that they have to gender and the ways in which that has affected their lives. And it's a very different approach and it would be something that I hugely advocate for, in that I think in these rather tense moments where turfism, gender critical, anti-trans, whatever you want to call those kind of organizers, are really kind of devoted to creating a very established narrative of gender. A really radical principle is to get people in a room together and say that we are bringing vastly different interpretations and experiences of gender together. How are we going to hold that tension in ways that allow for us to work together? And I think we have a huge history of kind of feminist principles to look to facilitate that. And I have found that hugely beneficial.
So, Nari, did you, like the question before was about the strategies, right? When we have an issue at the table where the different activists, organizations, actors do not necessarily agree on, right? So how do you overcome that? You know, your main way of working together is to work actually with the people, to have a personal relationship. So my sub question is that also part of a strategy for people to be your partners in work on a daily basis?
Yes, this happens by default. Sometimes we face stigmatization even from our partners. It is true. By working together, we try to resolve such issues. In my work, I visibly talk about my activism as a trans woman sex worker, because I believe my visibility has a very positive impact on the community I work with and on partners who I work with. The purpose of my visibility is also to help people understand that sex work is work. Predominantly, it may be a work that most of us are forced to engage in, because otherwise, for trans women in Kazakhstan, there is no way of doing other types of formalized work. Trans people cannot get their gender markers changed in their documents and thus cannot get employed. So by talking about what we do and how we do it, we also build alliances around us.
We have just enough time for a second short question from the participants.
Yes, we have a second question from the audience. Our intersectional perspectives lead to individual experiences. How can we embrace these differences while upholding collective goals, inclusion, and respect?
I think it's about holding the humanity at the heart, isn't it? It's about being open to hearing the stories, cheerleading people, whether you understand completely, agree completely, recognizing that that is the strength of a movement. No movement is about being the same, thinking exactly the same, but that politics of solidarity, that belief that you can hold tensions between things, and that you can have a shared goal whilst having individual differences between, is absolutely critical and vital. And I think that having, I could sound like the 50-year-old I am and go, life before social media was easier. And of course, there were elements that it was and elements that it wasn't. But there is a danger that we become about broadcast rather than about listening. And we develop solidarity and empathy and compassion through hearing people's stories, which Neera was just saying, and through wanting to look beyond ourselves and out to that benefit for the collective. So we don't have to agree 100%. We won't agree 100%, but we do have to work together, because we will only make progress when we stand together as a movement, but also invite others in and drive forward on the basis that most people, most sensible people anyway, want people to live safe, decent lives. And how do we drive that forward collectively?
Very briefly, I suppose, just kind of because that question really made me think about my own PhD, which was kind of looking at like this idea of transnormativity, like this idea that there can be like a hierarchy of transness that emerges in relation to kind of like whiteness and able-bodiedness and like neurotypicality and like middle-class identity. And I think one of the ways in which we can intervene into the challenge of that question is to make sure that the movement doesn't reproduce a certain idea of how to be trans in a way that affords legibility and legitimacy, and to be kind of mindful of how those narratives get perpetuated in the ways in which we organize and advocate at a variety of different levels.
Nadia, I would also invite you just to try to respond to that.
I would agree with other panel speakers. The issue is very complicated, but also easy at the same time. This is about being able to accept differences. Each of us are so different, our understanding of the life and the world around us may differ. It would be wrong to assume that everybody thinks the same way. This kind of perception would be a crime for oneself, first of all, because by thinking we may have similar understanding of the world, we wash away our individuality and how each of us perceive the world.
Thank you very much. So I think what we've been hearing throughout already the interventions that all of you have been making, or individually you've been making, is that there is a lot of different forces that will try to pit us against each other. From external forces such as the scarcity of resources or even the abuse of identity politics, for example, can get in the way of us standing together, working together, being unified around our fights towards the external factors and the context. But then also we've been hearing and reflecting a lot concretely, what are those things that we can really use to make ourselves stronger, our organization stronger, our movement stronger, to be able to stand more in unity. And one of the things that we keep hearing is that we need to make sure that everybody is reflected. We cannot achieve that if the cost is exclusion, right? And I think this is something that I have been noting down. And to finalize our panel, I would like to just invite you all for a final 2-3 sentences reflection of how can we celebrate our successes, even in contexts where the situation is not good in general, but we still have successes and things to celebrate, where we've shown our common power and that things can move forward and we can support each other. So please, maybe Nari, this time I invite you to start.
There's this saying, find your own people and chill. When we face difficulties, and we face them quite often, causing us burnout as we work with cases of abuse all the time, and so we find support from the people who surround us. These may be our allies and supporters who help us in this fight. So that's it.
I think I would say 2 things. One is that joy and pain have always lived very closely together. And that is the hallmark of this movement. And so recognizing that, so when I first started working in the movement, it's when at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, and people were dying on a daily basis, and we were still dancing on the weekends because the dancing was part of the resistance and the power and the celebration. So I think recognizing and holding that joy and pain live closely together. And then the other thing which I think is worth just saying on this, and which links to strategies, is some of us will think that boycott is a good idea. Some of us will want to walk the halls of power. Some of us will be very, very good at holding groups for people to hold space. And some of us will be very good at writing. So also celebrating all of those things. And sometimes we can get a discourse, which is there is one way of doing activism. And there are so many ways of doing activism, and we must have people protesting in order for people to be inside. We must have people inside for people to be protesting. And if we can hold all of that together, then we can truly celebrate each other, not pit against each other.
I think mine was also going to be a big dirty dance. Yeah, so we celebrated a big dirty dance. Yeah, I think like I think for me, one of a big way to somehow kind of celebrate some of those successes, but also to maybe experience a kind of a reprieve from the constant sort of like organizing and like pushing against various different forces, is sometimes to allow to a certain degree yourself to kind of turn away a little bit from that noise and to kind of cultivate various different spaces that exist in community with people that are purely about the kind of beauty around kind of queer and trans existence, like the dance floor. But then also I think some of it is finding ways in that kind of, like you were saying, Simon, kind of like stay with the trouble of we're going to have different methods, but if in the round we are all dedicated to the same like liberatory ambitions about another kind of world being possible, then I think that's what's going to sustain us, is that like if we can go on a big night out and in the smoking area argue about how we're going to do it, but that we are going to do it. That's the kind of most important thing, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you to have the courage today to take this stage, to have the courage to work across differences, and to have the courage and find the strength and resilience, even though these words are difficult sometimes to hear, but we have them and we do them every day. So thank you very much for all your work and all your efforts back home.
You've been listening to The Frontline with me, Brian Finnegan. Thank you to all our guests today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, comment, or share wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tune in next time when we'll be travelling further on the front lines of LGBTI activism in Europe and Central Asia. Bye for now.